Welcome to Creepy Enigma. Just find a comfortable spot, place your phone to the side, and let your mind drift. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the story take you into the shadows. I drive trucks for a living, and I work with a company that assigns me deliveries. They handle all the scheduling with clients, and I just follow the route and deliver the cargo as instructed. It can get a bit hectic, especially when they stack up a bunch of short-distance trips back to back, but this time I was assigned a long-haul job across the country, and honestly I was glad to have some uninterrupted highway time without too much juggling. I was driving from the west coast to the east, and this was my second full day on the road. My plan was to drive from noon until midnight. I'm not too particular about where I sleep. I usually just find the next available truck stop, so I didn't bother deciding in advance which town I'd stop in. Around 9 p.m., I made my final stop of the evening at a small roadside gas station. I refueled, grabbed some generic energy drink to stay alert, and got back on the road. I figured I had 3 hours left to drive, and with traffic thinning out at that hour, I expected a smooth finish. I put on some country tunes and kept my eyes ahead, letting my mind drift here and there as I cruised along. Somewhere around 11 p.m., a sudden burst of static snapped me out of my thoughts. It came from the radio. I usually keep it tuned to the same channel as other truckers. It's kind of a common line we use to chat during long drives, though it's mostly quiet at night. I glanced at my mirrors and saw no headlights behind me, and the road ahead was empty too. Just as I was about to pick up the mic, that scratchy noise came through again, this time with a quick, barely audible voice. It lasted maybe a second, but I could have sworn it was someone either saying hello or help. The words were fuzzy, but it was enough to get my attention. I grabbed the radio and asked if anyone needed assistance. There was nothing but a faint buzz in response. The longer I listened, the more uneasy I felt. Something didn't sit right. Then my headlights caught something up ahead. I slowed down as I got closer and saw a large truck, another semi, just parked right in the middle of the single-lane road. It wasn't moving. I carefully pulled over to the side and brought my rig to a stop. It was immediately clear that this had to be the same vehicle I'd heard through the radio. There were no other trucks around, and the way this one was positioned, blocking the entire lane, was not normal. I thought maybe the driver had suffered a heart attack or passed out. It seemed like a plausible explanation for the abrupt stop and faint call over the radio. I stepped down from my cab and started walking toward the other truck. The only sound was the wind stirring through the grass in the fields that stretched endlessly on both sides of the road. I called out a few times as I approached, but there was no reply. When I reached the cab, the door was open. I looked inside and felt my stomach drop. The cab was empty. There was a jacket tossed over the passenger seat, a half-drunk coffee sitting in the cup holder, and the CB radio was swinging slightly from the ceiling, but there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing, just emptiness, like the driver had simply vanished. I quickly backed away and turned in all directions, scanning the road and the fields, but I saw nothing. The breeze rustling through the grass suddenly felt cold and strange. My heart was pounding, and I didn't want to linger a second longer. I rushed back to my truck, got in, and pulled back onto the road. As I drove off, I contacted the police to report what I'd found. When they arrived, they confirmed the semi was still there, still parked in the same spot, but the driver was gone. They looked into it and identified who the truck belonged to. He was officially listed as missing. During the investigation, they also discovered evidence that 3 other vehicles had recently been parked along the edge of the field near where the truck was left, but I hadn't seen any of them. No one could figure out why those cars were there. They conducted an extensive search for the missing trucker, but no trace of him was ever found, not a single clue about what might have happened. To this day, I think about that night often. If I had reached that stretch of highway a little earlier, whatever happened to him might have happened to me. Since then, I've been a lot more cautious when something feels off on the road, and I hope I never run into anything like that again. I was on a nighttime delivery run, driving through mostly deserted highways. At that hour, the only other vehicles I passed were fellow delivery drivers. Everything was going smoothly, and there hadn't been anything out of the ordinary during the first few hours. At around 2 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop to refuel and use the restroom. The next part of my route was going to take me through a long forested stretch, with little to no places to pull over, so I wanted to be prepared. Roughly an hour after that stop, while cruising down the dark, empty road, I noticed something up ahead. I had just a few seconds to see it clearly before I passed by, but it appeared to be a person standing on the shoulder. There was absolutely nothing else around but dense, remote woods. No intersections, no cars, nothing. So seeing someone just standing there without a vehicle nearby struck me as incredibly odd. In that brief moment I saw them, they didn't wave or call out or try to flag me down. They just stood there. I kept driving, but the image stuck in my mind. A mile or so later, I saw another figure, this time a woman. She was wearing torn jeans and a red hoodie. As I passed her, our eyes locked. She didn't smile or react at all, just stared with a blank expression. It gave me such a chill that I physically shivered. After I drove past, I glanced at my mirror and saw her still facing me, her head turning as I continued forward until the shadows swallowed her up. But when I looked forward again, I felt my chest tighten. I slammed on the brakes. The truck lurched from the sudden stop weight shifting as I brought it to a halt in the middle of the road. Lying directly in front of me was a person stretched out flat across the asphalt. They weren't moving. I couldn't tell whether they were hurt or not, but there were no signs of an accident. No debris, no vehicle, no indication that they'd been hit. The way their body was placed looked intentional. I had the instinct to check on them, but a deep unease held me back. Seeing 3 different people out here, within such a short distance in the middle of nowhere, felt more than just coincidental. I glanced to either side of the road, taking in the thick trees lining both edges, and that uneasy feeling only got stronger. After sitting there for about a minute, I shifted the truck back into gear and slowly drove around the person lying there. Even after I cleared them and started rolling forward again, my heart was still pounding. I looked in the side mirror as I continued to drive, and that's when I saw it. The person who'd been motionless on the road had gotten up and was standing watching me as I drove away. I stayed completely alert for the rest of the trip, shaken and on edge. I didn't see anyone else after that point, but I'm fairly convinced it was some kind of setup. Whoever they were clearly uninjured, which means they probably wanted me to stop and get out. What might have happened if I had? I honestly don't want to think about it. Given I saw a few others along the road before, that there's no way of knowing how many more were out there. Some of them could have been hiding just beyond the tree line, waiting for me to step out of the cab. Even now, just going back over that night in my mind gives me the creeps. I was making the usual trip from Omaha, Nebraska to Fargo, North Dakota. It's a route I run a couple of times each month, and honestly I enjoy it. The entire drive takes me through wide open farmland, flat roads, barely any traffic. It's an easy and relaxing haul. Since I drive this route so frequently, I'd settled into a routine. I always stopped to sleep at the same place, a large truck stop that sat between 2 tiny towns in South Dakota. For some reason, this stop was unusually big, considering how few drivers came through the area. On most nights, there were only a couple of other trucks parked there. The first leg of the trip went as usual, and I pulled into the truck stop a little after 1 a.m. But right away, I noticed something was off. The building was completely boarded up, all the fuel pumps were torn out of the ground, and none of the lights in the parking lot were on. It had clearly been shut down and abandoned. I can't say I was totally shocked, but it still threw me off. I had to decide whether to keep driving for another hour or try to sleep at this dark, deserted lot. On a normal night, I might have just parked and slept there anyway, but something about this time felt off. I didn't even think twice. I got right back on the highway and kept going. That decision didn't last long. Not even 20 minutes later, I was fighting to keep my eyes open. I barely managed to pull over onto a gravel shoulder before I felt too tired to keep going. I knew it wasn't ideal, but other truckers do this kind of thing all the time, so I figured it would be fine. I shut off the engine, locked the doors, put up my window covers, and leaned my seat back. Apparently, I underestimated how uneasy I felt, because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fall asleep. I must have been lying there for 20 minutes, eyes closed, hoping to doze off when I heard a sound. It was a high-pitched squeak, like old brakes coming from behind my trailer. I leaned forward and tried to listen more closely. Then I caught the faint hum of an engine somewhere nearby. At first, I assumed it was a police cruiser pulling up to check on me, which wouldn't be unusual. But when I peeled back the window shade and checked the side mirror, I realized the car wasn't a patrol vehicle. It was something else, but I couldn't make out the make or model in the dark. Before I could think it through, I heard someone call out, just a simple, "Hey," but it made my stomach drop. I immediately reached for the ignition to start the truck, which of course takes a few seconds. As soon as the engine rumbled to life, I could hear fast footsteps sprinting toward the cab. They reached the passenger door and started yanking the handle hard. As the truck finally began moving, the person jumped up and grabbed hold of the door, locking eyes with me through the window. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a thick, unkempt brown and white beard and a dark hood pulled up over his head. He pounded on the glass furiously. Just as I was merging back onto the highway and gaining speed, I heard a loud crash. The passenger window shattered. I jerked my head toward the broken glass, but when I looked out the door, the man was gone. In the side mirror, I saw him tumbling across the pavement. Either he let go or slipped off. I kept my foot on the gas until I was well out of sight. Thankfully, he didn't try to follow me. I called the authorities, but by the time they arrived, which took over half an hour, all that was left was the broken glass on the road. If he had managed to break that window even a few seconds earlier, I have no doubt he would have gotten the door open, and who knows what would have happened after that. That night taught me a serious lesson: if something feels wrong, don't ignore it. Every second counts, and it might be the difference between getting away and not getting away at all. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe and comment your city and the time you're watching. Let's begin. I'm really into hiking. A few years back, I was traveling across the country on a solo trip, trying to clear my head after a messy breakup. I had been planning to propose to someone I thought was the one, but everything came crashing down when I found out she had been cheating with one of my closest friends, no less. Total betrayal. I was 31 at the time. Utah was one of the states I had been most excited to explore. For anyone who loves hiking, it's a goldmine, packed with forests and trails that are the stuff of dreams. I picked out a spot in Wasatch Keys National Forest. I'd read great things about it, especially the fact that it had plenty of off-the-grid areas. I enjoy hiking solo, so crowded paths full of tourists just aren't my style. I chose a lesser-known part of the forest and drove my car as far as I could down this narrow dirt road. Once I couldn't go any farther, I parked, got out, and took a moment to absorb the scenery. I suited up and checked my phone. No bars perfect. I took mental note of where I was leaving the car, then set off. Now I know going solo through an unmarked trail isn't the smartest move, but following the beaten path never appealed to me. I always make sure to download a GPS map of the area beforehand. Most people don't realize that your phone's GPS still works even without a signal. And know before you assume I didn't get lost. That's not what this story is about. What actually happened still doesn't make sense to me. My goal was to reach a scenic overlook at the top of a nearby mountain, about 3 to 4 miles out. The terrain was tough, so I was only managing about 1.5 miles per hour. About an hour in, it started to rain, not heavily, but enough to annoy me. Hiking in the rain is a huge pet peeve of mine, so I turned around and started heading back. Eventually, I caught sight of my car again and felt relieved that this outing would just be a bust and nothing more. But when I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Every single tire had been slashed. That's when panic set in. There's no way all 4 tires just happened to go flat. Someone had deliberately done this. I quickly scanned the forest spinning in place. Nothing. I strained to hear even the smallest sound, but the steady patter of rain on the trees and underbrush drowned everything out. I had to think fast. with no phone signal and no nearby towns, my options were limited. I remembered losing service over 20 miles down the road, and hiking back that way would leave me completely exposed. I figured my best bet was to gain elevation. The lookout I had originally planned to reach was probably the highest point around, and I prayed it had reception. So I turned back toward the woods and started climbing again. About halfway up, I heard something behind me, leaves rustling softly about 40 yards back. The sound would pause and pick up again every time I stopped or moved. I didn't dare look behind me. I just picked up the pace. I'm a fast hiker, and I figured I could outdistance whatever, or whoever it was. The light was fading as the sun dipped behind the trees and with the rain still falling, the whole place took on this eerie vibe. I was anxious. I occasionally glanced behind me, but didn't catch sight of anything, though someone could have easily hidden among the countless tree trunks. Eventually I reached the summit, and by some stroke of luck there was reception. I didn't waste a second, no time to enjoy the view. I called the police, told them my exact location, described what had happened with my tires, and mentioned that I thought someone might be following me. I also let them know I had AAA. I hung up relieved that at least someone knew where I was. But I still had to get back to my car, and now I had to do it with darkness, closing in while avoiding whoever had been following me. Marching straight back down the same route seemed like asking for trouble. I figured my safest move would be to loop around, take a wide semicircle down, re-entering the woods from a different angle. I hadn't studied this side of the forest too closely, so I pulled out my map and hoped I could navigate it well enough. Things started off fine. The woods were quiet. I didn't hear anything unusual for a while, and I thought maybe I'd lost whoever was out there. But I jinxed it. Less than a minute after having that thought, I heard a branch snap to my left. I turned quickly, nothing. A few minutes later, another sound, this time directly behind me. That's when it hit me. There was more than one person. I picked up the pace, breaking into a light jog. Then I saw something that took my fear to a whole new level. Tucked away off the trail was a small makeshift campsite. A dozen logs were arranged in a circle around a recently used fire pit. Someone or multiple people had been there not long ago. I didn't stop. I ran past it, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. A few minutes later, I heard something to my right. I turned quickly enough to catch a glimpse of a foot disappearing behind a tree. That was it. My jog turned into an all-out sprint. I didn't care how loud I was, I just wanted out. The noises around me got louder, more branches cracking, more footsteps. Whoever was out there wasn't even trying to be stealthy anymore. I was definitely being chased. I ran heart-pounding, afraid to look back, but eventually I gave in and glanced over my shoulder. At least 6 people, all dressed in white, were barreling toward me. The next few minutes were a blur of fear and adrenaline. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. It felt like I was running for my life, because I probably was. Finally, my car came into view, and parked just ahead of it was a police cruiser. I made it to the officer, nearly collapsing as I caught my breath. I looked back, nothing. Whoever had been chasing me had vanished. The cop told me he'd already contacted AAA on my behalf, which I was incredibly thankful for. I gave him a detailed report of everything that happened. What he said chilled me. Apparently, Utah has one of the highest populations of Mormons in the country, and it's not uncommon to stumble into parts of the forest used by isolated religious communities. The area I had explored had a deep history tied to fringe cults and wilderness sects. He said it was very likely I had wandered into the territory of one such group, and that it had been extremely reckless to venture into unmarked parts of the forest alone. Honestly, he was probably right, but what still eats at me to this day is why. If they were upset about me trespassing, why not just say so? Why stalk me? Why destroy my tires? Why chase me through the woods? I still think about it all the time. I wouldn't call myself a professional hiker, but I've been passionate about hiking for decades. I've walked nearly every major trail in the country and visited over 75% of America's national parks. With so much already explored, I've had to find new ways to keep the adventure alive. Lately, I've gotten into a slightly unconventional habit using Google Maps to locate unnamed forest areas and setting out to explore them. Sure, it's risky, but that's part of the thrill, or at least it was. To keep myself from getting lost, I created my own system. Using homemade trail markers, little stickers I place on trees as I go. I remove them on the way back to avoid leaving any trace behind. I'm honestly surprised more people haven't caught on to this. It pretty much guarantees you can always retrace your steps. This time though, I had a bigger challenge ahead. I had decided to explore the forest around Dudleytown in Connecticut. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because it's known for being completely abandoned since the 1800s and surrounded by eerie legends and bizarre events. Look it up if you're curious. Personally, I don't buy into paranormal stuff. I'm not the superstitious type. Technically, the area is restricted to the public, but that's never really stopped me before. I figured it would actually work in my favor, less chance of running into anyone else, which is usually what I prefer. Being from New England, the drive wasn't even that long. I stepped into the forest around noon, making sure I had plenty of daylight to complete my hike. Right away, something felt off. I'd heard that Dudleytown was unusually quiet, but I wasn't expecting complete silence. You don't realize how much ambient sound you take for granted in a forest until it vanishes. It felt like standing alone in a soundproof room, only my own breathing broke the stillness. That sort of silence wasn't entirely new to me. I'd been in forests where wildlife was strangely absent. I tried to brush it off and continued hiking, placing my markers and doing my best to shake off the unsettling vibe. I kept expecting to stumble across some form of life, an animal, a bird, even a bug, but nothing. Eventually I found myself hoping to encounter another human, which says a lot about how on edge I was. For a brief stretch, I actually began to relax. The oppressive silence faded into the background, and I finally found a rhythm in my hike. But that calm was shattered suddenly by a sound I can only describe as a low, drawn-out moan, like the cry of an injured animal. It didn't sound like any creature I'd ever heard, and I've heard a lot. It was especially jarring because it was the only sound I had heard since entering the forest. I stopped in my tracks, listening carefully. It wasn't the wind, there was no wind. I told myself it was a wounded animal, even though deep down I knew better. I started walking away from the noise until it faded behind me. You might be asking why I didn't just head straight back to my car at that point. Honestly, I still don't have an answer, I guess. I convinced myself that unless something else happened, I'd keep going. As I walked, my mind started racing. How could an animal get hurt in a place like this? There wasn't a sound of a gunshot, so I figured maybe some hunter injured it before I arrived. But who would leave a wounded animal like that? That didn't sit right. While these thoughts ran through my head, I came across something carved into the bark of a tree. No joke, actual markings. They weren't letters, not even close. Just weird slashes and patches of missing bark. I looked around and noticed that nearby trees were also covered in these strange symbols. That was enough for me. Without hesitation, I turned around and started heading back, pulling off my markers as I went. Normally, I'm pretty curious by nature, but even I was thinking, yeah, I'm done here. After a bit of retracing my steps, I noticed something strange up ahead. What looked like a cave, or possibly a bear den. I stopped, puzzled. I knew for a fact that I hadn't passed that on my way in. I never missed details like that. Then something dawned on me. The trail markers were now at waist level. They should have been shoulder height. That chill you get when something's very wrong. Yeah, that hit me hard. I spun around and ran, heart-racing, eyes darting behind me. Somehow someone had moved my stickers, trying to lead me toward that cave. But how had they been following me? I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I didn't have time to sort through it. I just ran crashing through the brush without caring how much noise I was making. Everything was silent except for my own footsteps. Panting. I stopped long enough to check my phone and somehow got a single bar of signal. I opened my map and located my parked car. I was close, but before I could celebrate, the signal cut out. Didn't matter, I knew which way to go now. And then the wailing started again, only this time it was twice as loud, and felt so close I could almost feel it on my neck. I took off in a full sprint, faster than I've ever run in my life. I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. Every time I looked back, I saw nothing but the sound stayed right behind me. The last 10 minutes were a blur of terror and exhaustion. I finally broke through the tree line and reached my car. As if on cue, the wailing stopped. I jumped in and sped away before I even had a chance to process what had just happened. That day completely changed how I feel about hiking. Here's my best guess at what was going on. Some recluse or forest dweller spotted me, tracked me, and started messing with my trail markers to guide me toward that cave. I assume they used some kind of whistle to make that unsettling wail, which would explain how the noise could cut off so quickly once I got away. Of course, there are gaps in that theory, like how could someone run that far while blowing a whistle non-stop? If anyone out there has a better explanation, I'd love to hear it. Maybe there's a reason that patch of forest is still closed to the public. Back when I was a teenager, my house was the go-to hangout spot. For my group of friends, there were a few reasons for that. My dad had this enormous basement set up like a man cave, complete with a practically endless stash of beer. On top of that, my parents were pretty relaxed. They let us drink downstairs and generally left us alone. Our property was pretty big, and it bordered a sizable patch of forest. If you followed the trail through those woods, you'd eventually come out onto a dirt road. Just across that road sat the reservoir, a place that meant the world to me. When I was younger, I had cut more holes in that fence than I could count, and eventually the Water Commission just gave up fixing them. Technically, it was off limits. Civilians weren't allowed on reservoir property, but to me it was a refuge. I'd go there to smoke, cool off after fights with my parents, go for a swim, or just think. It really was beautiful, and honestly one of the only things I still miss from that time in my life. One night a few of us were in my basement playing pool, some loud EDM music blasting in the background. Then my friend Chester threw out the idea of walking through the woods to the reservoir. We were getting bored, so the rest of us, Rick, Jasper, Hassan, and me, agreed. The sun hadn't fully gone down yet, so we figured it would still be light enough to find our way. If I remember right, Rick and Hassan grabbed a few beers to take with us. They were usually the ones drinking the most. I'd already had a couple myself, so I decided to take it easy. It had rained earlier in the day, so the trail was still muddy in some spots, but we'd already committed to the plan. Once we crossed the fence into the reservoir property, we had to walk a bit further, but we headed toward this cliff on the near side that we liked to hang out on. After a while, someone suggested we head to the far side, a stretch we called the beach because of its smooth shoreline. To get there, we had to walk along the edge of the water to a crossing point, and then follow the opposite side around. It took about 20 minutes, but we finally made it. And that's when things got unsettling. Hassan suddenly held up his hand and pointed off into the distance. We all looked in the direction he indicated, still on our side of the reservoir, but much farther down. Something was moving near the tree line. We quieted down and watched as the figure slowly approached the water. At first we were intrigued, curious even since random encounters at the reservoir weren't that unusual. But as the figure stepped into clearer view, we realized he was dragging something, a large black garbage bag. Whatever was inside seemed heavy, judging by how slowly the person was moving. None of us said anything out loud, but I think we all came to the same conclusion. There had been bodies pulled out of that reservoir before. We stood, frozen eyes locked on the person crouched over the bag at the water's edge. It was hard to see exactly what he was doing from that distance, but it gave us enough time to think we should leave while he was distracted. Before we could move, Chester suddenly noticed more movement. 3 more figures emerged from the forest. 2 were also dragging bags, and the third was carrying a kayak over his head. That's when it got real. The first man got into the kayak, while the others helped load one of the bags onto his lap. We watched horrified as he paddled out to the middle of the reservoir and dumped the bag into the water. Then he returned to shore and repeated the process 2 more times. And then, of course, my phone rang. The obnoxious ringtone shattered the silence, and in my panic, I fumbled to mute it. but the damage was done. All four of them turned in unison to look straight at us. We bolted. Rick shouted that they were chasing us, and I could hear the panic in his voice. Running through a forest is hard enough, doing it with adrenaline and fear pumping through your body is another level. We raced down the bank back to the near side and pushed through the woods, heading for the same hole in the fence we'd used to get in. That's when I realized I couldn't remember where the hole was. My friends caught up and started to panic too, as I ran alongside the fence, scanning it desperately. It felt like we'd be trapped there forever. But then Rick spotted it and yelled out. We sprinted to it. I was helping Chester through when I heard a branch snap behind us. They were close. The chase didn't end there. We kept running all the way back to my backyard. Once we made it, Hassan called the police. We explained everything, and they said they'd send an officer over. I figured I'd get in trouble for trespassing, but at that point I didn't care. My friends were just relieved we got out of there. I, on the other hand, was still on edge. It wasn't far from the reservoir to my backyard. They could have easily followed the trail. When the police arrived, we gave them a full account. They searched the area, and my heart sank. When they found something, a set of muddy footprints leading right up to our backyard fence. I told them the prints weren't ours. I never jumped my own fence. They seemed to believe me. They didn't find anyone else nearby, but they told us they'd keep us informed. To my surprise, they actually did. A few days later, news broke that 3 bodies had been pulled from the reservoir. My parents and I were on edge for weeks. My mom swore she saw figures moving in the woods at night, even claimed she saw a camera flash one evening. That whole incident was one of the biggest reasons we ended up moving away. Years later, and the case was never solved. No arrests, no suspects. I was recently reminded of all this after reading an article about a teenager who drowned in that same reservoir. It brought everything rushing back. That place is cursed, and I still wonder how many other dark secrets it's keeping, the ones no one ever finds out about.
Hello.
I was hitchhiking my way from Velden, Germany to Belvoir, hoping to reach an art exhibit where I needed to collect a few paintings. That's when I met him, a Frenchman with a scruffy beard, wearing worn-out clothes. He was short, looked unkempt, and seemed close to my own age, which was 29 at the time. He didn't speak much English, and I didn't know a single word of French. I had no idea who this man really was. It was October, and the day was pleasant. The sun was out, the sky was blue, and the temperature was ideal. Perfect weather to be traveling on the road. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, I met him at a petrol station somewhere in rural France. He offered me a lift in his old beat-up vehicle, and I gladly accepted, relieved to be on my way to Belvoir. As we cruised along the main highway, we exchanged some small talk. Mostly, he asked where I was from. Then suddenly, without warning, he leaned over my lap to open the glove compartment. Inside, he had what looked like a stack of documents, passports. He handed them to me. There were 4 of them. The first belonged to a young woman, whom he said had been his girlfriend. She had apparently died after falling off the back of his motorcycle. The second, also a girlfriend, had passed away in a car accident, he told me. The third, he said, succumbed to a brain tumor. And the fourth, she had died after falling off a horse. I have such terrible luck, he muttered. I nodded, acknowledging his misfortune. That's when the unease began. I was sitting in a car with a man who somehow possessed the passports of 4 deceased women. Soon after, he said we would be taking a shortcut to reach Belvoir. It didn't sound like a suggestion, more like a decision already made. At first, I felt relieved. Maybe this would get me to my destination faster. I imagined we'd cut through scenic villages and quiet roads lined with cottages and farmland. But instead, he veered off onto a narrow dirt path that branched off the highway. I had a bad feeling immediately. Still, I didn't say anything. Why do we stay silent at moments like these? Maybe it's politeness or fear disguised as manners. The dirt road wound its way through open fields at first, across the bright green French hills. Eventually, we reached dense forest land. As the path tightened, the trees grew closer, and the light faded. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the woods were swallowing us. Despite the anxiety creeping up my spine, I couldn't help but notice the haunting beauty of the place, both breathtaking and eerie. That's when the man abruptly said in broken English, "I not speak English anymore." It wasn't a request. Then he fell silent. That silence echoed. We were deep in the forest, and I could feel adrenaline begin to stir in my veins. My instincts were beginning to prepare for something. Fight or flight mode was kicking in. Communication between us had officially ended. I knew I would have questions soon, but I also knew I wouldn't dare ask them. By now, it was 5 p.m. The sun was slipping behind the trees, and the forest around us was growing darker. The man looked tense, lost in his own world, and I noticed his lips twitching slightly, like he was muttering to himself. His movements felt controlled, but strange, snake-like almost. I moved my hand quietly toward the door handle. I'm sure he noticed. The car began to slow down. I didn't say anything. Was this the moment? Did he have a weapon? Would he try something? It felt like time had paused. I was now caught in a surreal scenario, not what I had planned for that day. Maybe I had somehow transmitted my awareness to him. Maybe he sensed I wasn't going to go quietly. I wasn't helpless. I had my own strength, my own history of navigating tough situations. There was something raw and primitive happening between us, a kind of silent calculation. In just a few seconds, we both seemed to assess the other. Could one overpower the other? Could either one kill? All the details, pain, death, blood, swirled somewhere in that unspoken analysis. These kinds of mental battles probably go differently when one person is smaller, afraid, and pleading. Then it just becomes a hunt, a scene of dominance, terror, and despair. By 5:12, the car had slowed to a crawl, and something inside me shifted. I felt myself enter a state I'd never been in before, mentally prepared to do whatever was necessary. Perhaps he saw it in my face, or sensed it in the air. My hand was still on the door handle, and then suddenly he sped up. We were moving again, faster this time, back toward civilization. Thank God. These memories have only resurfaced while writing this. Some details I'm not fully certain about. Did he say one of his girlfriends attacked him, and he had to hit her with a shovel to make her stop? Were there 2 backpacks in the back seat, and did he explain them? Did I just block that out? Were there more than 4 passports in that glove box? Why didn't I tell him to stop the car? Eventually, the road widened again. We left the forest and drove into a sunset smeared in deep red and orange. I could hear the sound of traffic again, and soon we reached the main highway. Small houses dotted the horizon across the road. I still didn't know where I was. Then he asked if I'd like to spend the night at his place. He said we could share a meal. Instantly, a mental image of a grimy basement full of tools and chains flashed in my head. I declined, politely but firmly. That was the first thing I had said since he told me to stop speaking English. To this day, I believe that if I had broken that silence in the woods, if I had started talking nervously, things might have ended very differently. Remaining silent may have saved my life. Maybe one of the women from those passports couldn't stay quiet when fear overtook her, and maybe that was what gave him permission to unleash something monstrous. I got out of the car by the side of the road. It was almost fully dark. I watched as he drove off into the night. I never reported anything to the authorities. I didn't speak French, and I kept telling myself maybe I had just overthought everything. I yelled something into the sky, a mix of confusion and disbelief. What had just happened? I ended up sleeping near the highway, too drained to do anything else. The next morning, I looked down at my hands, half expecting them to vanish. I was still alive. 2 decades later, I was in a cafe in Lauenburg, Germany, tutoring a business student in English. Somehow, the topic of hitchhiking came up, and I told him the whole story. Right then, he pulled out his phone and searched for French serial killers. He turned the screen toward me and showed me photos. There he was. It was him, the man I'd shared that silent ride with all those years ago. His name was Lucien Armand, a serial killer who was active in 1990. At the time of my journey, authorities had been finding bodies of young women abandoned near highways across France. My girlfriend back then had warned me about hitchhiking, saying a killer was on the loose. I've often thought about those women. I've wondered if some of them, and maybe others, were buried in the very woods we passed through. I wish now that I'd gone to the police. I've tried since, but the authorities told me the case is closed. He's serving time, and they're not interested. That guilt stays with me. The thought that maybe I could have helped stop more deaths. Maybe some part of the victims came with me that day, escaping that forest through my survival. Maybe that's why I still feel the darkness flickering inside me. It was a rainy evening, and I was on my way home after finishing a late shift at the small 24-hour cafe where I work. The night had been slow, not many customers, yet for some reason I still felt oddly alert. I already knew I'd need to take a melatonin tablet when I got home if I wanted to get any sleep. I followed my regular route, a road that's pleasant during the day with scenic views, but turns pitch black at night due to the lack of streetlights. Here and there, you'll find a small plaza with mom-and-pop shops or diners, but mostly it's just endless stretches of woods. As I passed one of those familiar parking lots, a spot known for its popular sandwich shop, I noticed a woman standing beneath a lamppost. She was out in the open, drenched from the rain, and holding her arm up, trying to flag me down. I slowed the car and saw that she was a woman likely in her mid-50s. She was surprisingly tall, at least 5 feet 11 inches, maybe even taller but very slim. I rolled down my window and asked, "Do you need a ride?" She hurried over, opened the passenger door, and started thanking me profusely, calling me a lifesaver. I asked where she was headed, and she replied that she just needed to get a bit further up the road into town. Despite her soaked clothes leaving puddles on the seat, I didn't feel right turning her away in this weather. I try to do the right thing when I can, although I'll admit I'd probably think twice about giving a random man a lift under similar circumstances. She seemed friendly enough, though I couldn't help but notice a few missing teeth, which was a bit unsettling. It crossed my mind that she might be homeless, although she didn't give off that usual appearance or smell. Still, the rain might have masked that. Her hair, soaking wet, hung flat against her head. It might normally be messy, but the rain had likely weighed it down. Even so, she kept smiling and chatting, and didn't seem dangerous. We came up to an intersection with a fuel station on the corner, so I pulled in to fill up. I figured I might as well ask if she wanted anything from inside, trying to go the extra mile in being kind. She declined politely with a, "No thank you, sweetheart." So I went in alone, paid the clerk, and grabbed a few spiked seltzers for the weekend. When I returned to the car, the passenger seat was empty. She had vanished. I glanced around the small parking area, but it was quiet and there was no sign of her. It was like she had just disappeared. I felt a bit uneasy, almost guilty, wondering if she'd gotten lost or wandered off in confusion. But I also felt a weird sense of relief. I filled up my tank and continued the rest of the drive home. Once I got back, I went straight into my apartment, which takes up the ground floor of a 2-unit house. Another tenant lives upstairs. The building's front door that leads to the foyer is usually left unlocked, but each apartment has its own lockable door. I stepped inside, got out of the rain, and placed the seltzers on the kitchen counter. I still wasn't sleepy, so I took the melatonin and tried to settle in for the night. Even with the melatonin, though, my brain just wouldn't settle. I kept replaying that weird encounter over and over in my head. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises from the hallway, but I figured they were just sounds from the neighbor upstairs. I really wish I had been more alert before finally dozing off. Later in the night, I woke up in complete darkness, something that normally doesn't happen when I take sleep aids. They usually knock me out cold. I felt groggy and parched, so I reached toward my nightstand for my water. That's when I noticed movement. Something, or someone, was crouched in the corner of my room, partially hidden behind my dresser. My first instinct was that I was imagining it. I shook my head, rubbed my eyes, even gave myself a slap to snap out of it. But then the figure slowly rose to a standing position and silently walked out of the room. I didn't scream, I didn't speak, I just sat there in absolute terror. The most disturbing part? I didn't hear a single sound, no footsteps, no doors creaking, nothing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He answered, puzzled as to why I was calling so late. I told him exactly what had just happened, and he calmly suggested, Kim, it was probably just a night terror. I stayed on the line with him while I got up, turned on the living room lights, and checked around. The apartment was small, and it was clear no one else was there. I almost managed to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Still, I locked my bedroom door before trying to sleep again. The next morning, I made myself some coffee and got ready for the gym. But when I went to open the door to the foyer, I found it already unlocked. That made my stomach drop. Could last night's experience have actually been real? I searched the apartment again, but there was no one there. I walked out to my car, opened the back door to throw in my gym bag, and that's when I saw it. The floor in the back seat was covered in damp, yellowish-brown stains, and the blanket I always kept back there, it was gone. I felt like I was about to cry or scream. Suddenly, everything made sense while I was inside the gas station. That woman must have snuck into the back seat. Either she found a way to unlock my apartment door later, or I had carelessly left it open. Panicked, I called my dad again and asked him what I should do. He told me to check whether anything had been stolen, and that if nothing was missing, the police probably wouldn't be able to help much. I looked through the place again, but nothing seemed out of place aside from that missing blanket from the car. I skipped the gym entirely. In fact, I stayed holed up in my apartment for days after that. I felt deeply unsettled. I couldn't shake the feeling that my space had been violated. After that month, I made up my mind I had to move, and I did. A few months back, something happened that I still can't fully make sense of. For some reason, I agreed to tag along with my friend Jordan to a house party he was invited to, even though I wasn't actually invited myself. It was during our first year of high school, and Jordan managed to talk the hosts into letting me come. Since I couldn't drive yet, I had no option but to ride with him. We arrived at the house late at night. As we parked, Jordan turned to me and suggested I leave my phone in the car. He said it was safer that way, less chance of misplacing it, or having someone I didn't know snatch it while I wasn't paying attention. I thought it was a weird request, but I nodded and went along with it. The party was mostly happening in the backyard. I followed Jordan as we made our way in. Scanning the yard, I saw groups of teenagers gathered around, drinking, smoking, and some likely doing other things I didn't want to think about. Jordan nudged me and said I should go around and introduce myself to a few people. After a couple of hours, I realized I had way too much to drink. My vision was blurred, and I could barely keep my balance. I staggered toward the house and leaned against the exterior wall to steady myself. I glanced at my watch. It was somewhere around midnight, maybe even closer to 1 a.m. That's when I decided it was time to head home. I started looking for Jordan, even though all I wanted to do was collapse. I searched the backyard for him, but couldn't spot him anywhere. I asked a few people if they'd seen him around, but everyone said they hadn't. That's when I remembered my phone was still in his car. I reached into my pocket out of habit, only to be reminded of that dumb decision. I was stuck. The only option left was walking home, and luckily I remembered my house wasn't too far from here. Still, the cold autumn night wasn't exactly ideal. I thought about asking someone else for a ride, but I didn't really know anyone well enough. so I stuck with the idea of walking back by myself through the dark. I made my way onto the street, my steps wobbly and unsteady. It was obvious I'd had too much to drink, my head was spinning, and I felt dizzy. After a few minutes of slow, shaky progress, I reached the main road and kept walking, zoning out and letting my mind wander. I couldn't stop thinking about why Jordan had ditched me, or why I'd listened to his ridiculous advice about the phone. I was angry with myself for drinking so carelessly and getting into this situation in the first place. Eventually, I stopped walking, too tired to continue. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself to try and stay warm. That's when I remembered the concept of hitchhiking. With a glimmer of hope, I stuck my thumb out and waited. Several cars drove by without stopping. Minutes dragged on, and my hope began to fade. It was now well past 1 a.m., and while a few cars passed, none of them paid any attention to me. I considered walking again, but quickly realized I wasn't in any shape to do that. Just when I was about to give up, a gray pickup truck pulled over and came to a stop. I felt a wave of relief and stumbled toward it. The window rolled down to reveal an older man with a scruffy beard. He asked if I needed a lift. I nodded and gave him my address before climbing inside, thankful that someone had finally stopped. As we drove, the man tried making small talk. He asked me what had happened, how I'd ended up out there. But I wasn't really able to hold a conversation, I was too disoriented. The best I could manage were a few mumbled replies and faint groans. Then we turned down the street where my house was located. But instead of stopping, the truck kept going. I told him he had just passed my place, and immediately a sinking feeling hit my stomach. Something wasn't right. I wanted to get out, but I was too out of it to move properly. I was just about to ask him to let me out when he suddenly glanced over at me. The look on his face had changed. It was cold, unsettling. "You really shouldn't hitchhike when you're drunk," he said with a creepy smirk. "Makes you an easy mark." Then he reached over and started touching my leg. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I could tell they weren't good. Right before anything worse could happen, a loud siren wailed from behind us, and red and blue lights lit up the inside of the truck. It was the police. Inside, I felt a surge of relief. The man immediately froze and slammed on the brakes. He hit the unlock button, and I wasted no time. I leapt out of the truck and ran. A police officer came straight to me, and I frantically explained everything that had just taken place. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything clearly illegal that had happened yet. The officer told me he had pulled the truck over because someone matching the vehicle's description had allegedly stolen from a nearby shop. He didn't confirm if it was the same man, but either way, I was just grateful he'd shown up when he did. The officer gave me a ride home. After that night, I made a firm promise to myself. I'd never let myself get that intoxicated again. I understood now just how important it is to stay aware and responsible even when you're just out trying to have fun. In 2007, I was 9 years old, and my older brother was 14. One day our mom gave us $30 to catch a movie and maybe grab something to eat afterward. Once the movie ended and it had started getting dark, I was ready to head home, but my brother wanted to get food first. We decided to walk a couple blocks to a burger joint near the theater. While we were walking, a man came up to us holding the hand of a young boy. He looked warm and casual, smiling big, like any regular dad spending time with his kid. He said, "Hey, would you two mind helping me and my son for a second? We just need to load a mattress into our truck. It's just up the street." My brother told him we couldn't help because we were in a hurry. I remember glancing at the boy. He looked about 8. He was way too skinny, wearing clothes that didn't fit right, and had this blank, distant look on his face. The man kept insisting, saying it wouldn't take more than a moment. I actually started nudging my brother to go help, but he was fixated on the boy, and he looked really unsettled. Then out of nowhere, he grabbed my wrist and said, "Oh, I think Mom's right over there," and started pulling me in the opposite direction. I was confused. He was clearly making it up, but he didn't stop until we were a good distance away from the man and the kid. When I looked back, the guy's cheerful smile had turned into an angry glare. He jerked the boy's arm, and the two of them walked off. I started asking my brother all kinds of questions, but he hushed me. He took out his phone, called someone, and started pacing back and forth. Not long after that, a couple of police officers showed up, and then our mom arrived to take me home. My brother stayed back to talk to the cops. When I asked Mom what was going on, she just told me the man wasn't safe and that I should go to bed. By the next morning, I'd nearly forgotten it all. Years passed, and the memory faded until one day it hit me again out of nowhere. I was an adult by then, and my brother was 22. I gave him a call and asked him straight up what had really happened that night. What he told me made my blood run cold. While the man was talking to us, trying to get us to come help him, my brother caught something strange. The boy had looked right at him, terrified, and mouthed the words, "I'm not his son. Please help me." Then just as quickly his face went blank again. That's what had made my brother freak out and get us out of there immediately. He'd called the police and described the man as best as he could, but since we never saw the vehicle, they didn't have much to go on. A few weeks later, authorities discovered the boy's body in a wooded area. He'd died from starvation and dehydration. Turns out he'd been missing for nearly a month. His parents had been searching everywhere. The man had kidnapped him and used him as bait to lure other kids. If we'd gone with them that night, we could have ended up in the same situation. My brother was older and stronger, which likely meant there were others working with the man. The worst part: the people behind it were never found, not a single arrest. I still think about that boy often, just 1 year younger than me at the time, and wonder about the terror he must have felt in his final days. Back in the summer of 2013, I was 24 years old, fresh out of grad school, living with my dad and our dog in the house where I'd grown up. It was located in a fairly upscale neighborhood in a big city in Nevada. My daily schedule was predictable. I'd spend the mornings applying to jobs online, and my afternoons at a large park about 25 minutes away in a more worn-down part of town. The park featured a nice running path, a man-made pond, and quiet areas filled with birds and trees. I usually went during the weekdays around the same time, and the people I'd see most often were elderly folks, moms with toddlers and teens on summer break. It was a big enough park that it never felt packed, and even though the area wasn't the nicest, I never felt uneasy. I'd been raised with a sharp sense of awareness. My dad was a lawyer, and one of my uncles used to work in federal law enforcement, so I always stayed alert. One Saturday, August 24th, I was sitting around bored and decided to browse Craigslist's missed connections section for fun. I was scrolling through the men seeking women ads when one caught my attention. The title read, "To the girl I always see walking," and it was posted in the same city where the park was. The message was full of typos, but it described me to a T. My clothes, my build, the exact park, even the color of my shoes and shades. The guy said he felt a spark and wanted to learn more about me. I was weirded out, but curious too. I'd never noticed anyone paying me any attention at the park. Using a burner Gmail account, I replied and asked which park he meant. He responded right away and confirmed it was the one I went to. He said his name was Ray, claimed to be 33. A former military guy, 6'1", with olive-toned skin, dark short hair, tattoos, and a lean build. He said he worked nearby and would bring his dog there on lunch breaks and claimed I'd definitely seen him. He added something off-putting, "When I run I slow down just to watch you." Then he sent me 7 low-quality pictures he'd taken of me, walking and jogging, some clearly from recent days, and asked, "This is you, right?" My heart was racing, but I wanted more info before reacting. I didn't confirm anything, but asked what he looked like. 30 minutes later, he sent 3 separate pictures of different men. None of them matched his previous description. I did a quick reverse image search on Google and discovered 2 of the photos were stolen off social media. and the third belonged to a man who had died under suspicious circumstances a few years earlier. That photo had come from an online tribute site. I called him out on the fakes. He replied with his phone number saying he'd explain everything if I just called. I looked up the number online and found out his actual name was Ray, and he lived with his mother in a house near the park. He wasn't 33, he was 42. He had no criminal record that I could find. I gave in and called him using our landline's blocked number. He sounded older than I expected, and when I confronted him about his age, he admitted he was 40. Not 33, said he didn't want to come off as too old. He claimed the photos were of his brother and friends, which I knew was untrue. After more pushing, he finally sent me a real photo, a heavy-set man with greasy hair. Then he started bragging, talking about expensive cars, vacations, and money. Things turned dark fast. He rambled about liking women in tight clothes and said young girls were his favorite to watch. I got off the phone as soon as I could, after he said he was heading to a bar near the park that night. Shaken, I called my close friend Leo. He was like a big brother to me and worked in law. After I explained everything, we came up with a plan. I'd go to his place, leave my car there, and he'd drive us to the area near the bar Ray had mentioned. It was a busy Saturday night spot. I waited in Leo's car while he went in to order a drink and scan the place for Ray. Leo had seen the real photo I'd received, so he'd know what to look for. I stayed on the phone with him, nervous, but staying put. About a half hour later, Leo came back to the car, looking unsettled. Without saying anything, he told me we should drive around a bit before heading back, totally unlike his usual composed self. When we finally got to his place, he led me to the basement den, where we wouldn't wake his brother. Then he told me what happened. The bar was pretty dead, just a few stragglers finishing drinks and a birthday party clearing out. He sat down, ordered a beer, and within moments a man who looked just like the photo sat beside him and struck up a conversation which was rare for our city. The guy was clearly sober and started boasting about his wealth, just like Ray had on the phone. Then he launched into a weird tirade about how hard it was to meet good women, and how things didn't work out unless he took matters into his own hands. Leo later told me it sounded like he was admitting to hurting or forcing women. Leo, who came from a family with experience in mental illness, said it was clear the man wasn't right in the head. He paid for his drink and started to leave. But right before walking out, the man leaned in and said, "Tell your friend I'll be waiting for her at the park Monday." The worst part, Leo never mentioned me, and I hadn't given Ray my real name or any personal details. I never went back to that park again. I ignored every new message from Ray, which became increasingly aggressive and disturbing. I figured he had mental health issues, and that engaging would only encourage him. He didn't have my full name, personal number, or real email, so I felt fairly secure. A few months passed. I started a new job, got a new phone number, which only my father, close friends, and employer had, and put it all out of my mind. I made a habit of ignoring block numbers just in case. Then, on November 26th, while I was at work, I received 5 back-to-back calls from blocked numbers that went to voicemail, followed by a 6th call from a regular number that didn't leave a message. That evening, I checked my voicemail. A man had left several recordings of himself reciting vulgar lyrics from the song "Me So Horny" in different voices, saying my name over and over, making crude threats and sexual remarks, and fumbling with the phone while hanging up. I searched the last number. It was Ray's. He must have called without realizing it wasn't blocked. I still don't know how he got my new number or learned my name. Maybe he overheard something at the park. I blocked the number. Thankfully, he's never contacted me again. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and although I've moved on, I can't help but think how close I came to something truly dangerous. It was a warm night in late July, around 10 p.m. I was 17 at the time, and home alone for the week, while my parents were away on a trip with their friends in the Caribbean. I suddenly remembered I hadn't taken our young dog out for his evening walk. Not wanting him to be restless all night, I figured a quick stroll around the neighborhood was better than nothing. We were out for roughly half an hour before heading back. I went up to my room and turned on my Xbox, blasting the volume. Even with the loud game sounds, I thought I could hear something coming from downstairs. At first I dismissed it, thinking it was just the house settling. But the noise continued, so I muted the TV and tried to listen closely. As soon as the room went quiet, so did the sounds. I shook it off and got back to gaming. About an hour later, the noises came back louder and clearer this time. I was unsettled, but decided I needed to check it out and prove it was nothing. I figured the sound was coming from the basement, so I headed there. The moment I opened the basement door, a burst of cold air rushed past me. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I immediately noticed that one of the basement windows was wide open, one I clearly remembered locking before I left with the dog. My first instinct was to run, but something held me back. That's when I noticed the door to the basement closet was cracked open. We never used that closet, it was always shut. I froze in place, staring at it, debating whether I should open it. I must have stood there for ages before I finally reached for the handle. Just then I heard movement from inside. Someone was definitely in there. I took off upstairs without looking back, locked myself in my bedroom, and dialed the police. When the officers arrived, they began searching the house. Not even 5 minutes later, I heard a gunshot ring out from the basement, followed by shouting. Soon after, they came out with a wild-looking man in cuffs. He appeared to be homeless and mentally unstable. One of the officers explained that when they opened the closet, the man was crouched inside with a gun aimed at them. He fired once and missed before they managed to wrestle the weapon away and take him into custody. What shook me most was how close I had come to opening that closet door myself. Had I gone through with it, I might not have walked away. Since that night, I've never felt truly at ease being home alone again. I'm 22 years old and work as a truck driver. I've been with a major transportation company for a few months now, ever since I completed my training and was assigned my own rig. Traveling along the most remote highways in the U.S., especially during the night, can lead to some unsettling experiences that really play with your mind. One night in particular stands out more than the rest. I was driving through a barren desert area. It was pitch black, bitterly cold, and I was still about an hour away from the closest truck stop. In an effort to stay awake, I had the AC blasting ice-cold air directly onto my face. Not the smartest method, I know, but sometimes on this job you've got to do what you can, especially when you're far from any place to rest. Out of nowhere, something darted across the highway right in front of my truck. It disappeared into the shrubs on the opposite side, before I could even process what I'd seen. All I caught was a flash of white fur, something running on 4 legs, roughly the size of a big dog. Wildlife crossing roads is common, so I didn't think too much of it at first. But not even a minute later, I heard a loud thump, and my truck veered sharply to the left, nearly drifting into the other lane. I quickly corrected the steering to avoid losing control. I assumed an animal must have struck the truck hard enough to cause the sudden movement. I pulled over to check things out. Inspecting the side of the trailer, I noticed a huge dent, about 5 feet across and 7 feet high. The shape wasn't clear, just an enormous, misshapen impact. I couldn't wrap my head around what might have hit me. Maybe a rock had rolled into the truck, but that didn't make sense. The terrain around me was flat, no hills or slopes anywhere in sight. That's when I heard footsteps crunching over the dry dirt behind me. I turned around and felt my heart sink. Roughly 50 feet away stood a towering white figure. It looked like a warped version of a dog, huge, eerie, and completely unnatural. Then, disturbingly, it rose up onto 2 legs. It must have been at least 7 feet tall, with an unusually wide build. I stood frozen, locked in a stare with this thing. It let out a low growl before slowly turning around and dropping back onto all 4s. Without hurrying, it started walking away. I stayed still for what felt like a full minute, trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. Then adrenaline kicked in. I bolted back to my truck, slammed the door shut, locked it, and took off. Pushing the truck as fast as it could go, I sped for the next hour straight until I reached the truck stop. When I finally got there, I tried to rest, but my nerves wouldn't let me. I've never encountered anything like that again, and I still have no explanation for it. The massive dent in my trailer was proof enough that I hadn't imagined any of it. Whatever that thing was, I hope I never come across it again. When I was 16, I did a lot of babysitting, mostly for friends of the family, but sometimes for people I didn't really know, referred to me through others. One evening, I was watching a little girl named Lily for a family I'd worked with several times before. Everything started off just like usual, around 8 or 8:30 p.m. Lily asked if she could play on the swing set in the backyard. It was already getting dark, but after enough begging, I gave in and let her play for a little while. We were outside for just a few minutes when I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching us. I couldn't pinpoint why, but it gave me the chills. I looked around the yard and the surrounding area, but didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling stayed with me, and I told Lily it was time to go inside, since it was close to her bedtime anyway. I got her ready and put her to bed around 9 p.m. Then I went back downstairs to the living room and turned on the TV. About 10 minutes later, I heard some noise coming from outside, like something moving around in the yard. Feeling responsible, I went to check. I stepped outside, looked around, and saw nothing. Assuming it was probably just an animal, I went back inside and sat down again. Roughly 20 minutes passed before I heard footsteps from the second floor coming from Lily's room. Thinking she was up again, I went upstairs to put her back to bed. But when I opened her door, my stomach dropped. She was fast asleep. The room was dark, but moonlight from the window allowed me to see a shape in the far corner, a figure crouched down, just staring. I immediately turned on the lights, and there he was, some dirty, scruffy man I'd never seen before. I didn't stick around to see what he'd do. I bolted out the front door and ran straight to the neighbor's house to call the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house and found the man still in Lily's room, crouched in the same corner, but the light was off again. They arrested him on the spot. It turned out he had been secretly living in the family's basement for half a year, sneaking in and out through a hole on the side of the house. He confessed to watching the family from the shadows while they were outside, and even while they slept. That night shook me to my core. I never accepted another babysitting job again. This happened back in 2015. I had planned a solo road trip to a forest a few hours away because I wanted to check out an old abandoned fire lookout I'd read about. It was something I'd been really looking forward to. I should mention, technically speaking, entering or camping in the structure was against the rules, since it hadn't been maintained in years and could be unsafe. Still, I'd read a few forum posts where people said it was standing strong, though the latest post I found was already 3 years old, so I wasn't sure what to expect when I finally reached it. Eventually, I found a small ditch off the roadside to park in. I grabbed my backpack with 2 days' worth of supplies and started hiking. There weren't any official trails leading there, so I used a handheld GPS unit to make sure I was headed the right direction, though the entire route just cut through unmarked terrain and thick forest. The hike took about 4 or 5 hours. The deeper I went, the denser and more rugged the surroundings became. I was counting on the fire tower still being intact and hopefully safe enough to crash in. If not, I figured I'd find a decent spot nearby to pitch my tent for the night. Eventually, after what felt like an exhausting trek, I spotted the lookout rising above the treetops. As I got closer, I was surprised to see that it didn't look too bad. The paint had peeled off, and it was weathered, sure, but structurally it seemed all right. I gave a few pushes to the support beams, and they felt solid, so I decided to risk it, and climbed the metal ladder which groaned under my weight but held firm. When I reached the top, I stood there stunned by the view. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. No roads, no buildings, no signs of life, just trees as far as I could see. After taking it in for a moment, I circled around to the entrance and stepped inside. The space was small, maybe 150 square feet, not like the big lookouts that get turned into Airbnbs. There was an old deteriorating bed frame in one corner, and a rotting wooden desk in the other. The windows were falling apart, spanning the walls, but mostly intact. There wasn't much else. I set my gear down, rolled out my sleeping pad and bag, and used my little camping stove to heat up a meal. When the sun started going down, I sat out on the ledge and watched it disappear behind the trees. Honestly, it was one of the most beautiful sunsets I've ever seen, but it seemed to fade quickly, and then night came. The sky was thick with clouds, so there wasn't any moonlight or stars, just pitch black. I sat there for a while longer, taking in the stillness. About an hour into the night, I noticed something strange below a light moving among the trees. But it wasn't a flashlight. It had a warm orange flicker like firelight. It looked like someone was walking with a torch. That struck me as odd. I mean, what were the chances of someone else being out here in such a remote location at the same time? There wasn't even a marked trail to this place, and using a torch instead of a normal flashlight. Even weirder, I watched the flickering light drift through the woods for a bit before it moved behind some trees and vanished. I waited for it to reappear, but it never did. I stayed out there for a while longer, soaking up the silence. Eventually it started getting chilly from the wind, so I stood up to take one last look before heading inside. That's when I saw someone down below. They were standing in the clearing between the forest and the base of the tower. It looked like they were staring right up at me. Maybe it was the person with the torch? "Hey," I called down, not sure what else to say. The person didn't respond, just kept staring. It went on for maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Then they raised a hand, kind of like a wave or a gesture of acknowledgement. After that, they turned and walked back into the woods without any light. It was definitely unsettling, but strangely at the time, I convinced myself it was just another hiker. Maybe someone checking if the lookout was already taken. I couldn't explain the lack of response or why they walked away in silence. But I stayed out there a little longer before heading inside to warm up in my sleeping bag. Falling asleep wasn't easy. The wind rattled the windows and the beams creaked overhead. But eventually I drifted off. I'm not sure how long I was out, but I suddenly woke up to silence. The wind had died down and it was still dark. I blinked a few times, confused, wondering what had woken me. Then I heard the faint sound of metal creaking. It was the ladder outside. I sat up thinking, maybe I was imagining things, but the sound came again. Metal hinges softly groaning. Someone was climbing up. I couldn't tell how far up they were, but the sound was clear. It was getting faster, like they were rushing. I unzipped my sleeping bag, grabbed my backpack, and stepped out onto the ledge, my heart pounding. As I did, the noise stopped. I stood there frozen, waiting. Then I slowly crept around the walkway toward the corner. Where the ladder came up, no one was there. I edged closer, heart racing, and leaned over to look down. The ladder was empty. Confused and terrified, I stood there for a second trying to make sense of it, when suddenly I heard rapid footsteps behind me. I turned just in time to catch a glimpse of a shadow moving past the windows on the opposite side of the tower. Without a second thought, I dropped onto the ladder and started descending as fast as I could. My hands slipped a few times on the cold rungs and my whole body was shaking. I was halfway down when I looked up and saw a head peek over the edge above. I didn't stop moving. I hit the ground and ran into the forest. Looking back, I don't even know why I grabbed my backpack when I got up, but I'm glad I did. It had my flashlight and GPS, and those saved me. I navigated back through the woods to my car. As far as I know, no one followed me. I drove off and never turned around. I had gone camping for the weekend at a small remote lake. It wasn't meant to be anything major, just a quiet getaway in the woods beside the water to relax for a few days. The first day went exactly as planned. I arrived, pitched my tent, and spent the day lounging around. The spot was pretty isolated. It had a faint footpath leading in, but nothing marked on any online maps. It was the kind of place only locals knew about. My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid. In all those years, whether with him or coming out on my own, I had never once run into another person here. There weren't even traces that anyone else had ever visited. On the second day, I spent my time walking around the lake, thinking and enjoying the calm. I probably circled it 3 or 4 times during the day. Everything stayed peaceful until one lap changed everything. That's when I noticed footprints near the edge of the tree line. It startled me. I had already passed the same spot several times and hadn't seen anything before. The prints were fresh and clear. There was no way I had missed them earlier. What made them more unnerving was that they weren't shoe prints, they were barefoot tracks. That part of the lake didn't even have easy access to the water, so it wasn't like someone had taken off their shoes for a swim, and if they had been in the water I would have seen them. The whole thing gave me an uneasy feeling. If someone else was out here, why hadn't I seen them? Had they been hiding and watching me? I couldn't shake the discomfort. The footprints appeared to lead from the trees to the lake's edge, then back into the forest, heading deep into the woods. I had no desire to follow them, so I turned back toward my camp instead. For the rest of the day, I kept looking out toward the trees, scanning the perimeter to see if anyone appeared, but no one ever did. As the sun started to dip, my anxiety returned. The footprints still felt wrong to me, and knowing someone had been there, maybe still, was left me unsettled. When it got dark, I built up the campfire with a solid stack of wood and tried to relax. I did everything I could to distract myself, but it wasn't easy. Part of me thought I was overthinking things. Another part said my discomfort was completely reasonable. Then sometime after nightfall, I heard footsteps coming from the woods. I whipped my head toward the trees. The sound was clear, more than one person walking slowly in my direction. I stayed still watching until finally 2 figures stepped into the glow of the firelight. A man and a woman stood there side by side, just outside the fire's reach. I couldn't make out their faces, only their silhouettes. I couldn't even tell how old they were. "Can I help you?" I asked. The moment the words left my mouth, the woman turned and bolted into the forest. She vanished into the dark. The man, however, didn't move. He didn't speak, didn't look after her, just stood there still as ever. That's when I noticed something chilling. He wasn't wearing shoes. These had to be the same people who left the footprints earlier. I asked again if he needed anything. He didn't reply. After a few seconds, he turned and walked quietly back into the trees, just as wordlessly as he'd arrived. Internally, I was spiraling. That had been one of the strangest, most uncomfortable moments I had ever experienced. It didn't even feel real. I made up my mind then and there. I wasn't staying another minute in those woods. I started packing up immediately. I don't mess around when things feel off. Luckily, my setup was simple, and within minutes, everything was packed down and stashed in my bag. I didn't know where those people had gone, and I didn't want to be around to find out. I kicked the unlit logs from the fire so it would die down quickly, then set off into the woods. The hike back was nearly 2 hours. For the first 10 minutes, I was tense, constantly checking over my shoulder, listening for anything unusual. But the farther I got, the more at ease I began to feel. Then about 40 minutes in the forest became dead quiet. Not even insects made a sound. That's when I heard running, footsteps fast, deliberate, off in the distance, maybe 100 feet away. Definitely human. I couldn't see anything, so I kept walking, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later it happened again, this time on the opposite side of me. The steps sounded softer than they should have, which made me think whoever it was barefoot. It had to be the same 2 I saw earlier. If they had followed me this far, what were they trying to do? The footsteps kept coming, brief bursts of running, then silence. It felt like they were tracking me, moving quickly from one side to the other, always staying just out of view. I've never felt fear like I did during that hike out. Somehow, though, I made it to my truck. I jumped in, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. I never figured out who those people were or what they were doing out there. I don't know if they were dangerous, lost, or something else entirely. South. I'm a 24-year-old woman from northern Arizona, and this happened a few years ago. Back then I was living full-time in a small camper van, traveling along the West Coast. There are all kinds of ways people choose to live on the road, in vans or RVs, but I preferred staying away from big cities and camping near small towns between destinations. Most of the time, though, I'd park deep in the backcountry. Being alone in the woods felt more comfortable to me. than trying to stealth camp in some crowded parking lot. Honestly, it just felt safer. Cities could be sketchy at night, but when you're out in the forest with no one around, you only have to worry about wildlife and the occasional strange noise. It was quieter, and I liked it that way. At the time, I was slowly working my way between two major cities in Washington. I was taking back roads, staying at little campsites for a few days each. On this particular day, I turned off the road onto a narrow dirt path that wound its way deep into the trees. There were a few small clearings along the way, but they were all empty and looked like they hadn't been used in a while. I kept going until I found a larger pull-off at the end of the trail. It wasn't anything scenic, just dense woods in all directions, but it was private and quiet. The space was big enough to turn around in, and someone had even made a fire pit out of stones in the middle. I parked, leveled the van, and set up for the evening. Since it was spring, it rained nearly every day in Washington. There wasn't much to do outside, so I opened the sliding door for some fresh air and started making dinner on my propane stove. It was around sunset, still early, so I had a while before bedtime. Over the next half hour, the sun dipped below the horizon and the rain started falling harder. I slid the van door closed to keep water out, leaving a small window cracked near the back for ventilation. I laid on my bed, pulled out my laptop, and started watching a show. Halfway through the episode, I noticed a glare on the screen, a reflection of light coming through the small window behind me. Before I could react, the light disappeared. Not by moving, but by shutting off like someone flicked a switch. I turned around and looked outside, but saw nothing. It was pitch black and pouring. I had no idea how far the light had been or what caused it. Since I was on a trail with other clearings, I figured maybe someone else had pulled in, and their headlights had bounced through the trees. Maybe they'd turned off their car quickly. The only thing that didn't sit right was the angle. The light hadn't come from the road I entered on, just thick trees were behind that window. Maybe there was another path I hadn't seen. There wasn't much I could do, so I turned back to my laptop. Every now and then, I'd glance out the window or think I heard something, but with the rain pounding the roof, it was hard to tell what was real. I never saw anything definite, so I tried not to stress. Around 10 or 11 p.m., I decided to turn in for the night. I shut everything down, closed the windows, pulled the covers across the glass, and laid down. It was nearly pitch black inside. Usually I had no trouble sleeping, but that night I just couldn't settle. The rain intensified, and eventually thunder joined in. It got so loud that sleep wasn't even an option. About 2 hours in over the storm, I swore I heard something outside. Something real. It sounded like someone or something running and snapping a branch close to the van. It was clear enough to make me sit up, but there was no follow-up noise, just silence. I peered through the window, but couldn't even see the ground. It was too dark. Still, I had the distinct feeling someone was out there watching. I closed the cover again, sat there and tried to tell myself it was nothing. A minute later, I heard a voice. A man's voice, quiet, like a harsh whisper, like he was speaking to someone else. I didn't dare look. If I pulled the cover back, they'd definitely see me, assuming they hadn't already figured out someone was inside. That thought alone made it worse. If they knew someone was in here, what did they want? After a couple minutes of silence, except for the thunder and rain, I heard something right outside the sliding door. It sounded like plastic flexing, like someone leaning their weight against it. Then came a knock. A few seconds later, another. I was frozen. They had to know I was in here, but I still didn't respond. Maybe they didn't know if I was alone, or if I was a man or a woman. That gave me a sliver of safety, at least enough to stay silent. They kept knocking slow and spaced out. 5 minutes passed. Still nothing said, just knock after knock in the pouring rain. Then finally a voice. "Sheriff's Department, open up." Yeah, right. I didn't believe that for a second. If it were true, why? Hadn't they identified themselves from the beginning? He kept knocking and calling out things like, "We need to talk to you. Open the door," and "This is law enforcement." It all sounded forced, like he was trying to keep it calm and avoid escalating. I lifted the window cover just a little slowly. All I could make out was a dark figure near the door. From the outline, I didn't see any badge, no uniform, nothing that looked official. That was when I knew this wasn't right. I sat there, heart pounding, running through my options. After half a minute of knocking, growing more impatient, I made up my mind I was going to risk it and drive out. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. Immediately I heard running two people sprinting toward the van from the side. One of them came into view right beside me as I started pulling out. Thankfully the van didn't get stuck. I made it back onto the trail and kept going. As I drove, I didn't see a single other vehicle. No one else had been out there, which made everything about what just happened all the more disturbing. Later I contacted the local county office to report what had happened. Unsurprisingly, they confirmed that no officers had been out in that area that night. And of course, I never heard anything back, whatever those people were planning. I'm lucky I got out of there. I haven't had any similar experiences since, but I'm a lot more cautious now.